What's up, everybody? Peter X. Coffer here for another episode of the Classic Rock Podcast. Been sitting on this and marinating on this episode for probably a month or two since I got the idea. So today I'm talking about the 10 most important guitarists in classic rock history. Because, since I've started this podcast, Classic Rock, I've focused a lot on the role of the guitar. Now, I chose the words and the title very carefully, the most important. I'm not going to talk about the best because I'm not a overly proficient guitar player, so I can't really sit there and say who's a better guitarist or than this or that. But I can, as a songwriter, tell you who, influenced others when it comes to songwriting, and ultimately great music comes down to songwriting. So, number one, Jimi Hendrix. Widely considered the best of all time. He, played in the era of the late 60s when the godfathers of classic rock, and I think the majority of the people on this list, played with him. They all acknowledged that Jimi was the best. So I'm not going in any order, but I got to start with Jimi because Rolling Stone had him at number one all time in their 250 guitarists from 2023. And I'm only doing numbers for the first couple, but I know all 10 of these guitarists are in that 250 list. But Jimi's number one for a reason. Jimi just approached the guitar differently from everybody else. He looked at it as an effects instrument. He used sounds that other guitars hated and threw away and tried to get rid of, or through playing and amps and pedals tried to, the feedback, guitars hated feedback before Hendrix, and it's still, they still don't use it very well since Hendrix. But that, he just really made the guitar speak a whole different language. The guitar became an extension of who he was, and I think he, more so than any of these guitarists, he merged with the guitar. It's interesting. He carried his guitar everywhere. So, he'd be walking through a neighborhood and his guitar would be strapped to his back. And it's interesting, when he came up, he was extremely poor. And so he would, his first guitar didn't even have all the strings. And he bought and sold a couple guitars at pawn shops. Maybe 3 or 4, coming up out of Seattle. And he didn't get his first guitar until, I believe it was Keith Richards' girlfriend when he was in New York. That's when he got his first Fender Stratocaster. So, he came up using pretty cheap guitars. His first guitar was not electric, and it didn't even have all the strings. But he was obsessed with the guitar, and he just made, nobody has ever made the guitar do the things Jimi did, and he heard things, and he melded things there, and then, he had ghost notes, he just did things that nobody else did. So Jimi started off in early to the 62, 63, 64, 65, I believe, playing the R&B blues chitlin circuit. And so, somewhere along there, he ran across a blues player, and you can play with your teeth. And so the big influence out there, supposedly, with Hendrix was Albert King. Supposedly, Jimi did jump on stage with Albert King once, and Jimi never talked about it, but Albert said he gave Jimi a lesson. He said he was a better guitar player than Jimi was. And he probably was. Jimi, the beauty of Jimi, he was rough around the edges and technically not correct sometimes, but that's what made him so good is you know, Jimmy, like a lot of musicians, didn't read music, but he didn't understand music theory either. I mean, I read Miles Davis's biography, and he talked, they ran into each other right before Jimmy died. As a matter of fact, his last concert was the Isle of Wight, and he was supposed to hook up there in Europe with Miles and do some recording, and unfortunately it never happened. But Miles was amazed by Jimmy's virtuosity on the guitar, and the fact he was so good and didn't understand any music theory. And what really set Jimmy apart and is his live play. I mean, he could be very tight if you listen to his studio songs. He's very tight and disciplined, but nobody could go on a journey with the guitar like Hendrix. I mean, Hendrix was almost like an author of a novel or a short story. He would take you on a 7 or 8 minute odyssey, but with the guitar. And Jimmy Page will come up later in this list, and Jimmy's a great guitarist. He would try to do that later, in the Led Zeppelin run with a Whole Lot of Love, but not as good as Jimmy. It's interesting. I remember I've almost made my way through the Get Back documentary on the Beatles, and it's, George Harrison is talking about, yeah, I can't do what Hendrix does. I can't do those long solos. I just get lost and don't know what to do. And love that George Harrison, he's also on this list. But the great thing about George Harrison, when I get to him, is he understands, he knows his strengths and weaknesses. But Hendrix, nobody could go on a journey like Hendrix could with the guitar. My all-time favorite Jimi Hendrix. I mean, obviously, Star Spangled Banner from Woodstock. He's that Purple Haze live version in at Woodstock is also a fire, and so is Hey Joe from Woodstock. And then I Don't Know and Machine Gun from the Band of Gypsies, and also his studio stuff. Voodoo Child is amazing, and Foxy Lady's really good. I love how he starts off that song, and I'm riffing now because I only had 3 songs, and now I'm down in the groove. Other songs by Hendrix are popping up. All Along the Watchtower is amazing, and he has a very different solo in that, and it's a drier solo. When I say dry, I mean it's not overdrive and distortion and all that. The effects are down on that one, and Jimmy loved the effects and distortion. One of the criticisms of Jimmy was he, sometimes he played sloppy, but particularly this album was released, this live album, in the last 2 or 3 years, and Jimmy sometimes would just go on stage and crank up the gain, which is to simplify it, it's volume, but if your gain is too high, lots of bad things can happen in the studio. You can get distortion and artifacts and everything else. But sometimes, in this Hawaii concert, Jimmy just goes out there, cranks up the gain, and it's almost like he's in a rodeo and trying to, wrestling with the guitar, and it's fascinating hearing him play, and the energy and this amazing tension between his playing and the guitar. And he didn't do this a lot, but he did do it, and it's always interesting. Because no guitarist would ever do that. And sometimes Jimmy just wanted a challenge. I mean, late in his career, Jimmy got really disenchanted with performing live because people wanted to, came for the parlor tricks. They weren't there to hear him play. They wanted to, play behind your back and your head and with your teeth and, between your legs. And Jimmy's like, hey, man, I'm playing some good music. So, yeah, so number one is Jimi Hendrix. Number two, Eddie Van Halen. These are the top shredders of all time. I mean, I think Rolling Stone in 2023, the 250 top guitarists, they put Eddie at 4. He usually makes everybody's top 10. But he's the second great shredder, and there's really two schools. I mean, there's, the folks influenced by Jimmy, and then there's the folks influenced by Eddie Van Halen. Eddie just had lightning licks and lightning fingers, but he was very, very famous for tapping, which is using his fingers. So he could use both hands on the fretboard, and rather than plucking or strumming, he would, he literally, play the guitar like, a piano. And so his dad was a jazz pianist, and in middle school and high school, he played classic piano for a while, and yeah, he was good. Eddie was very good. Eddie was the first to really go in and start modifying his guitar. He was very famous for his Frankensteiner, that iconic red with the black and white stripes. And, Fenders are, unlike Gibson, for years until the 80s and the 90s, late 80s and 90s, it was, it was either a Fender or Gibson or a clone of a Fender or Gibson. And Fender's always been built to modify. So, you take the neck off, take the pickups off and put different pickups on. That's not Gibson. Gibson, this is what you're getting. This is that's not. And so, when we'll get to Pete Townshend later. So, but when he smashes his guitar, Pete smashes, cheap Fenders, because, he can easily get another neck if it, if it's damaged or whatnot. But he put a lot of time, Eddie, into modifying his Stratocaster, and particularly keeping it in tune. I mean, he, brought in guitar technicians and paid a lot of money for that, and really, and tinkered with it himself. I mean, so, yeah, I mean, this, what can you say about Eddie Van Halen? I remember middle school, the first time I heard Eruption off the first album, my jaw just hit the ground, and it still does to this day when I hear him. And it's 50, almost, 40 plus years later, and Eruption still blows my mind. And I guess that was one of his warm-ups, and one of the studio engineers wisely recorded that warm-up. But, yeah, so what's must hear from Eddie Van Halen? Well, Eruption, you really got me. Everybody Wants Some. I love, you got this, for lack of a term, this jungle beat that, Alex Van Halen, Eddie's brother, and man, Eddie's just riffing around it. And an Atomic Dog, I mean, everybody talks about Atomic Punk. I'm thinking funk and George Clinton, Atomic Punk. So that's on the first album too, I think, maybe the second album. But man, oh man, listen to the tone. Everybody always, Eddie, the lead guitarist, but that rhythm guitar and that liquidy, just I don't know, it's distortion, but it's liquidy and it's elastic. Atomic Punk, check that out. And then he does, another great rhythm, guitar, and tone with Unchained. So, remember going back to Soul of the Guitar, it's the rhythm guitar brings the hook, and it's the tone that really makes it interesting. So Eddie was a great all-around guitarist. Number 3, David Gilmour, Pink Floyd. So you got the Shredders on one side, and then, on the other side you have David Gilmour and what I call the emotive. I mean, he has a different style. He's not shredding. He's not playing fast. It's a slow, deliberate, long, drawn out notes. Man, he's good. Right off the bat, Comfortably Numb, Another Brick in the Wall, Part 2, those solos. You just have to hear David Gilmour. Go to a Pink Floyd's greatest hits, Prince, from about 2005 on, really got good at this style of play, and it's usually mid-tempo songs. You're not getting lightning licks here, but you're really just, playing really complex stuff, and it just takes you places. I call it emotive because it really brings out emotions, and it is played with a lot of emotion. But David Gilmour, he's probably the best at that style of play. So I put him, you have the Shredders, and then you have the emotive folks. And number 4, Eric Clapton. Eric kind of sits in the middle. He can do both. But I think he's better at emotive, but he can shred. And interestingly enough, he's also very steeped in the blues, Eric Clapton, like Hendrix. Clapton was considered the best guitarist in the world until, Jimmy popped on the scene in late 66, 67 in England. So, so as far as Eric Clapton, his signature ones, Layla, Wonderful Tonight, and I also like Sunshine of Your Love and White Room. I think he does some really good rhythm guitar, and I like the tone he uses. But, Wonderful Tonight and Layla, beautiful playing, and that's more in the David Gilmour vein, but Sunshine of Your Love and White Room is a little more shredding. So, he's had many, many great songs. He's taken B.B. King on the road and other blues people, and he's done some live albums with those blues folks. So they're a long list of great Eric Clapton, and he's a good singer as well. And Hendrix was. I didn't even talk about Hendrix's singing. He didn't think he was a good singer, but he was. But check out Eric Clapton at 4. Number 5. This is where we get into a category of 3 very good songwriters, unique songwriters, and they have gone on to influence pop punk and now regular punk that's not really hardcore. And I call them songwriter guitarists because they kind of meld rhythm guitar with lead guitar. And so they'll do a solo and you're listening and it's like, is that a solo or is that a rhythm guitar? And they're very adept at that. And again, the rhythm guitar is what, is the hook that brings you in. So they have very melodic solos. Kurt Cobain is not on this list, but he's influenced by this style of play. So think the solo in Smells Like Teen Spirit and Come As You Are, very melodic solo. But first up is George Harrison of the Beatles. He was probably the first to get, good at this because he had, the assistance of, he had 3 great bandmates, but he also had, George Martin in the studio, teaching them and helping them with their songwriting. I mean, look, they were, immensely talented, but it did not hurt having, they didn't have to reinvent the wheel or reinvent, they had some help, unlike the Rolling Stones. But, Paul McCartney could be kind of a taskmaster, and he was very particular. And Paul could play everything. He could play the piano, he could play the bass, he could play the drums. The running joke was Ringo wasn't even the best drummer. And the Beatles, and Paul probably technically is a better drummer, but, Ringo was a better drummer for the Beatles, because when he left, Paul jumped on the drums and John jumped on the drums, and it just didn't work, and they had to, Ringo left for like 3 weeks, and then they had called him like, okay, Ringo, you're a better drummer, and then we thought, you're the perfect drummer for the Beatles. Please come back, and he did. George Harrison was the first to really understand the subtleties of playing in tone, because Harrison, like, I want you to play this, these notes, and then, and he brought, I've said this in other episodes on the Beatles, he really brought the mood to the Beatles through his playing. He's a very, deliberate, but, and very good with the subtleties of playing and playing up, the nuances of, and he, even though Paul was trying to be a taskmaster, he gave Paul what he wanted, but he also put his own stamp on things, and he did it his own way, and he brought brought a lot of emotion to the Beatles' music. He was kind of the emotional heft of the Beatles. I mean, Paul was the technician and the songwriter, and John was the great lyricist, and George really brought the soul and the mood and the emotion, and then Ringo was the backbone. So yeah, George Harrison, check out While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Beautiful song. Now here's the interesting thing. When I was talking about earlier Jimi Hendrix and how he he could, go on long journeys, and George Harrison, couldn't. One of the strengths of George Harrison as a guitarist is he knew his strengths and weaknesses. And I didn't know this until a few years ago, but the solo on While My Guitar Gently Weeps was Eric Clapton. They were good friends. And wisely, again, a good guitarist knows what he wants out of a song, and knows, if he can get that. And he, George Harrison knew he couldn't, that Eric Clapton would be better at bringing it, so he brought in Eric, and that's, genius songwriting on George Harrison's part. The other one is Something. I mean, listen to his, it's probably his best solo. I mean, the Beatles aren't known for their solos, and it's brief, but he doesn't waste a note. It's beautiful. Something. Number 6 on the list, also a songwriter guitarist. Keith Richards, and Keith and Mick Jagger were the main songwriters in the Rolling Stones, and they did not have George Martin there, guiding them. Again, man, he was blending lead guitar and rhythm guitar. I mean, the only solo I can think of, Keith even doing was Sympathy for the Devil. I mean, he was not a big soloer, but I can't get no satisfaction. I mean, that rhythm guitar and that, that tone, I mean, just wicked, vicious. Give Me Shelter, that haunting intro with his guitar, and then the backup singers there, Jumping Jack Flash and Street Fighting, man, and just great rhythm guitar along with tone going there. So yeah, I mean, again, a lot of people, Keith and George Harrison, and my next guitarist at 7, Pete Townshend, taught a lot of folks how to write songs on the guitar. So speaking of 7, Pete Townshend, again, another songwriter, guitarist. Uh, he was the main songwriter for the Who, so he did a lot of this himself. I'm not sure what else what other instruments he played though, but I will double check that shortly. Um, but he was in the concept albums. If you go back to the 1967 album, The Who Sell Out, I mean, that was the concept there was consumerism. And, most of their albums that he had some sort of concept, and maybe he didn't do it early on as good as well as Pink Floyd. I mean, in 67, he was, 24, 25, trying to do a concept album. But, every Who album gets better because Pete Townshend gets better at concept albums. And even though, rock and roll ain't king anymore, and, in the 2000s, those albums are good albums. These understanding concept albums because it's been doing them for a while. But best Pete Townshend songs, guitars, I mean, Pinball Wizard, a variety of tones he uses there. Magic Bus, Bob O'Reilly, or better known as Teenage Wasteland. Great, great, great songwriting and playing. And Who Are You? So, yep, I'm back. Just check. Pete Townshend does play everything: bass, guitar, keyboard, drums. Number 8 in the list, and Malcom Young. Everybody, Malcolm is Angus, the lead guitarist, and his brother's highly regarded, and usually is higher than Angus, on these, or Malcolm on these lists. But man, oh man, Malcolm is the best pure rhythm guitarist in classic rock history. The riffs speak to him. He's written more iconic riffs than, Keith Richards is there too, but boy. But again, Keith is what I call a hybrid where he uses rhythm and lead, and Malcom Young is a pure rhythm guitarist, and if Malcolm ain't there, we don't know how good Angus would be, because it's the rhythm guitarist that sells the records. That's who hooks you, and it's the guitarist who dazzles you. Malcom Young was also the principal songwriter for AC/DC. I mean, they've honestly, I don't know if I hear rumors they might go back in the studio, but Malcolm was such a good, so good with the riffs. We'll see if that ever happens again. And this, when he passed, I don't even know if they may have done a tour or two since he passed, but Malcolm was the heart and soul of AC/DC. But man, oh man, the riffs, Back in Black, Sin City, Highway to Hell, Live Wire, For Those About to Rock, We Salute You, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap. I mean, that gnarly, nasty bass, but he put his rhythm guitar over that to make it even nastier. So yeah, at number 8, the iconic Malcom Young. Number 9, Jimmy Page. Now I said Jimmy, at times would try to be Hendrix and go on those long journeys with the guitar and, with mixed results. But Jimmy Page was the master at tone. I mean, I did an episode on Stairway to Heaven. I don't know how many tones he uses in that song. But that was his thing. He played around with tones. He was a very accomplished guitarist on top of that. I know he influenced Eddie Van Halen. So, Page could definitely shred, but he could also, do that emotive stuff as well that, David Gilmour became good at. So he was a very versatile guitarist. So some of his best, I said, Stairway to Heaven, but you got the Immigrant Song, and that, oh man, that rhythm guitar is a wicked, and with its and the tone he creates with that. Whole Lot of Love. I mean, come on, Kashmir, Dazed and Confused. I mean, Led Zeppelin 1 and 2, I just took Dazed and Confused, but there's probably 6 or 7 songs that, where Jimmy just does a guitar clinic. And that's where those are the most blues based, and he was, Jimmy Page is heavily influenced by blues guitarists. But yeah, Led Zeppelin 1 and 2, I wore those out because listened to those for days. Black Dog's another one. And then I was talking about the emotive, thing he could do. Going to California on Led Zeppelin 4, listening, man, some beautiful playing there. Finally, at 10, Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck was mainly an instrumentalist. He's hard rock, but people say he did hard rock jazz. Go-to songs. I mean, he rarely used lyrics at all. So you just got to go find some Beck and listen to it. Particularly live, Jeff Beck, and he's very highly regarded. And I put him at 10 because he's the most versatile guitarist in classic rock history. Now, trying to think of this lineage, so I can't remember the order, but the Yardbirds started with Jeff Beck. He leaves, and I think Clapton comes in, Eric Clapton, and then Clapton leaves, and then Jimmy Page comes in. I believe that is the lineage, and I'm going to check it right now, because again, that wasn't in my notes, but you know how I get cooking and things pop up. So, got the order wrong. So the Yardbirds went Eric Clapton, 1963 to 1965, Jeff Beck, 1965 to 1966, Jimmy Page, 1966 to 1968, and then out of the ashes of the Yardbirds, Jimmy Page formed Led Zeppelin. So I thought I had it, but I didn't. But hey, we're on the right page now, and yeah, Jimmy Page, the right page. But yeah, so those to me are the 10 most important guitarists of the classic rock era. There's a lot of good guitarists. I mentioned Angus Young. I got one of my other favorites is Mark Knopfler of Dire Straits. Very interesting guitarist. You got to put the Doors guitarist, I believe it's Robbie Krieger I think Densmore was the drummer, but double checking that. But very Spanish influenced guitarist, but there's a lot of other ones. I'm just kind of throwing off names and doing kind of that, the honorable mention list. Yep, Krieger was the guitarist, got that right. Hey, Ace Frehley, Kiss was a good guitarist. Underrated. Gene and Paul go back at Ace, and sometimes he made mistakes, but Ace was like, I wasn't a perfect player, but wasn't trying to be a perfect player. Because sometimes, the greatness comes in imperfection. So, man, there's a lot of good guitarists out there. Joe Perry's another singer-songwriter guitarist. You could throw in of Aerosmith. You could throw him in the mix. So many great classic rock guitarists. Slash. Talking about efficient playing and the use of never a wasted note within his solos. Wonderful. He didn't get a whole lot of times to solo, but when he did, he made it count. So anyway, and I'm sure there's other great, guitarists. I don't have this list. I'm just thinking off the top of my head in classic rock. But gotta close with Slash because, I consider Guns N' Roses to be the final great classic rock band. So anyway, thanks for coming through. Hope you enjoyed this episode and be doing more on the Classic Rock Podcast. So, Got 5 albums on all the streaming services and here on YouTube, and my 5th album is now married to the first 4, so that's a good thing. Just had a new single drop, Babylon Nights, and working on some other singles. Uploaded a single, be dropping, let's see, Wednesday, February 21st, 2024. That one's called The Serpent, and working on others. Also working on another album, so I'm doing some mixed things and seeing how that goes. Also, I've written 2 science fiction fantasy novels and a novella that you can get on Amazon. And I'm thinking of, that science fiction fantasy series. I'm thinking of, in the spirit of The Who and the Pink Floyd, closing out those series with concept albums. Anyway, thanks for coming through, and I will see you next episode.